There is a moment in every long conversation where the room goes quiet, not because anyone stopped talking, but because someone finally said the thing everyone had been circling for years. That moment happened on Joe Rogan's podcast in January 2025, when Mel Gibson sat down across from him and, almost offhandedly, explained what he had actually built inside The Passion of the Christ. For 2 decades, people had debated the film's violence, its politics, its language choices, its box office numbers. What almost nobody had done was ask Gibson directly what he was trying to say. When Rogan finally did, the answer wasn't a soundbite. It was a confession. Gibson didn't frame it as a defense of his work. He framed it as an admission of intent, a filmmaker finally explaining, after 20 years of silence, exactly what every frame was built to do. And once you hear what he says, it becomes almost impossible to watch the film the same way again. To understand why that conversation landed the way it did, you have to go back to a version of Mel Gibson that most people have forgotten existed. By the mid-1990s, he was one of the most bankable stars on the planet. Braveheart had swept the Academy Awards, earning him Best Picture and Best Director. He had money, power, and the kind of industry leverage most directors spend a lifetime chasing. By every external measure, he had made it. And yet, by his own account, he was falling apart. In interviews given years later, Gibson described reaching a point where life felt hollow, where success had stopped meaning anything. He has spoken about standing at the window of a high-rise building, seriously considering whether to jump. This wasn't a passing bad mood. It was, in his words, a total loss of purpose. The outside world saw an Oscar winner. Inside, he was a man who no longer wanted to be alive. What pulled him back, according to Gibson, wasn't therapy or a career pivot. It was a single word, spoken on his knees alone. Help. That's it. No elaborate prayer, no negotiation with God, just a man at the end of himself asking for something bigger to intervene. Whatever happened after that moment, Gibson has said it changed the direction of his entire life, and eventually, it became the seed of the Passion of the Christ. In the aftermath, he threw himself into research. He reread the 4 Gospels, not casually, but as source material. He studied medical literature on what crucifixion physically does to the human body. He consulted historians and clergy, trying to reconstruct not the sanitized version of the story he'd grown up with, but the raw, historical one. Somewhere in that process, he came across a text that would shape the entire film, The Dolorous Passion of Our Lord Jesus Christ, a 19th-century account attributed to a German nun named Catherine Emmerich, who claimed to have experienced vivid visions of Christ's final hours. Gibson has described finding the book almost as an accident, a title that seemed to fall into his hands at the right moment. Whether you read that as coincidence or providence, the book's fingerprints are all over the finished film, from small details of clothing to the emotional reactions of bystanders that never appear in the gospel text itself. None of this made the project easier to sell. When Gibson pitched a film shot entirely in Aramaic and Latin, languages nobody in a modern audience actually speaks, every major studio in Hollywood turned him down. He has said publicly that he understood their hesitation completely. If someone pitched him the same idea cold, he probably would have said no too. But instead of shelving it, he financed the entire production himself, reportedly putting up around $30 million of his own money. No studio note-giving, no committee softening the violence, no marketing department demanding a friendlier cut. Just Gibson, a very unusual bet, and total creative control. The gamble paid off in a way almost nobody predicted. The Passion of the Christ became one of the highest-grossing independent films in history, made entirely outside the studio system, in dead languages, about the final 12 hours of Jesus' life. But box office numbers were never really the story. The story was what audiences did once they left the theater. People wept. People sat in silence long after the credits rolled. And people argued loudly for years about what the film was actually trying to do to them. That argument is exactly where Gibson's conversation with Rogan becomes interesting, because Gibson finally addressed the single biggest misreading of his own movie. For 20 years, the loudest criticism of The Passion of the Christ centered on its brutality. Critics called it torture porn. Audiences left theaters physically shaken by the scourging scene, by the visible damage done to Jim Caviezel's body on screen. The assumption, shared by fans and detractors alike, was that the violence was the entire point, that Gibson wanted to shock people into an emotional reaction. Gibson told Rogan that reading was backwards. The violence wasn't the message. It was the language the message was written in. He has said that modern audiences have become numb to the crucifixion because it's been reduced to jewelry and wall art, a pretty symbol stripped of its horror. Nobody looking at a clean silver cross around someone's neck is thinking about nails tearing through tendons, about a body slowly suffocating under its own weight. Gibson wanted to force viewers to reconnect with what the event actually was, physically and historically, because he believed that distance had let something essential go numb in people's understanding of their own faith. The graphic nature of the film wasn't there to traumatize. It was there to wake people up. Once you accept that premise, the smaller, stranger choices throughout the film start to make more sense, because Gibson didn't stop at physical realism. He layered the film with symbolic detail that most audiences never consciously registered. Take Satan's appearance in the film. There are no horns, no red skin, none of the cartoonish imagery people expect from religious cinema. Instead, Satan is portrayed as a pale, androgynous, almost serene figure who drifts through the background of scene after scene, largely unnoticed by the characters around him. Only one person in the entire film seems to see him clearly, Mary. On the road to Calvary, their eyes meet. She holds his gaze. He's the one who eventually looks away. In Catholic theology, Mary occupies a singular position, understood within that tradition as having been free from original sin from the moment of her conception, which places her outside Satan's influence in a way no other human figure in the story can claim. Gibson built that theological detail directly into a silent, 3-second glance that most viewers never thought twice about. Then there's one of the more unsettling images in the entire film, buried inside the scourging sequence, Satan cradling a strange, unnatural-looking infant while Christ is being beaten. Audiences who noticed it at all tended to read it as simply grotesque, an unexplained flourish of horror. But within the film's symbolic framework, it functions as a deliberate inversion of one of the most recognizable images in Christian art, the Madonna and Child. Where Mary holding the infant Jesus traditionally represents hope and the arrival of salvation, Satan holding a distorted child at the moment of maximum suffering reads as a kind of mockery, a dark parody suggesting that the sacrifice unfolding on screen is meaningless. It's not decoration. It's commentary, placed at the exact moment it would sting the most. Even the decision to strip away modern language was, in Gibson's telling, part of the same design. Every studio warned him that a film without English dialogue would be commercially dead on arrival. Gibson has compared the choice to looking at a Caravaggio painting or watching a ballet. Nobody needs subtitles to understand grief, fear, or reverence on a human face. By removing the safety net of familiar dialogue, he forced audiences to stop half-listening to a story they thought they already knew and start actually watching it, reading expressions and body language instead of coasting on memorized scripture. It was, by his own admission, a serious commercial risk, and one more reason, he ended up financing the film with his own money rather than convincing anyone else to take the bet with him. What made the Rogan conversation different from anything Gibson had said publicly before wasn't just the detail. It was the audience it landed with. Rogan has spoken openly, on and off his show, about his own complicated relationship with organized religion. During their conversation, he agreed with Gibson on something specific. That Christianity, more than most other belief systems, tends to get treated as fair game for public mockery in cultural spaces that otherwise pride themselves on being open to every faith tradition. That observation alone wasn't new. What visibly shifted the tone of the conversation was what came next. Gibson didn't lean on mysticism to make his case. He leaned on history. He told Rogan he views the gospel accounts as historical documents, not allegory, and pointed to sources outside the Bible that he believes corroborate the broader historical context of the events. Then he made an argument that seemed to genuinely catch Rogan off guard, that every one of the original apostles who spread the story went to their deaths rather than recant it, and that people don't typically choose brutal execution to defend something they know to be false. For someone whose entire public persona is built on interrogating claims other people take for granted, that argument landed differently than a typical faith-based defense would have. And that pause is where the real substance of what Gibson said begins, because according to him, the film was never primarily about first-century political and religious authorities, or even about a specific historical figure. Those are the surface details, the plot. The actual subject of the film, in Gibson's own words, is the audience watching it. He has said plainly that the intention behind the project was to communicate that everyone shares responsibility for what happens on screen, that the sacrifice depicted wasn't aimed at one group of people 2,000 years ago, but at every person who would ever sit down and watch it. When asked point-blank who was responsible for Christ's death, his answer wasn't a list of historical figures. It was simply, all of us, himself included, first in line by his own account. That idea explains something that puzzled a lot of viewers for years: why people left screenings in tears that had nothing to do with simple shock at the violence. If Gibson's intent worked the way he describes, audiences weren't just witnessing an execution. They were being asked to locate themselves inside the story, to see their own choices reflected in the crowd, in the soldiers, in the silence of the bystanders who did nothing. None of this erases the legitimate criticism the film has faced. Long before its release, religious leaders and historians raised serious concerns about how certain Jewish authorities were portrayed on screen, worried that specific choices in staging and dialogue risked reinforcing centuries-old anti-Semitic tropes. These weren't fringe objections. They came from serious scholars and became a central part of the public conversation surrounding the film for years. Gibson's response, then and later, was that Jesus and his followers were themselves Jewish, and that the story was never meant to pit one group against another, but to indict humanity as a whole. That explanation satisfied some critics and did nothing for others, and the debate never fully resolved. If anything, it dominated so much of the public conversation around the film that Gibson's deeper theological intentions, the ones he only fully unpacked decades later with Rogan, got buried under the controversy. Which brings the story back to its final image, the one Gibson keeps returning to whenever he talks about what the film was actually for. The very last shot isn't the resurrection played as spectacle. It's the Pietà, Mary holding her son's lifeless body, except she isn't looking down at him. She's looking straight into the camera, one hand extended outward, as if presenting the moment directly to whoever is sitting in the theater. Gibson didn't build a film about an event that happened in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. By his own account, he built a mirror and pointed it at the audience. 20 years after the film's release, that's the message Mel Gibson finally said out loud, sitting across from a man not exactly known for taking claims at face value. Whether or not you share Gibson's faith, it's hard to deny the conversation reframed a film most people thought they'd already figured out. The violence wasn't the point. It was never meant to be. It was simply the language Gibson chose to make sure nobody in the audience could look away from what he believed the story was really asking of them.